Hello everyone, today we talk about the Italian maritime antiquities, which requires an introduction. For an introductory video, of course, as you are habituated with on Schwerpunkt by this point. Jokes aside, this is a very important topic, as arguably everything that we cover here, regardless of the hyper niche that sometimes I'm told, but you cover hyper niche, it's not like something that may be niche in relative terms to today's pseudo-cultural standards is not important. Also, this is not really a niche topic, it's actually a fairly unconventional one, yes, but one that is actually big if you understand what we're going with this. Right, the history of the ancient Mediterranean from a naval, also just maritime point of view, the centrality of Italy, as far as at least the central Mediterranean is concerned, and later especially the Roman conquest of the same lake, so to say, the fact that such an important land is oddly underdocumented, as far as obviously like a bit as this more distant west before the Indo-European invasions, and also obviously before the development of specific, say, historiographies that we can more culturally relate with. We basically think as Westerners that the interesting story began with the Greeks, right? With Herodotus. Naturally, there is a lot of Egyptian, Mesopotamian, also including also Persian historiography that could in part help, but that indeed is secondary compared to what eventually, especially classical Hellenistic sources start discussing about, again, the land where the world conquerors would have arisen from, and that, as you know, is a quite complex one at the same time, in terms of settlement, in terms of unicity. I mean, just the shape of the peninsula, the 3,000 kilometers of coastland, the very strong demographics, very strong fertility of the land as well, and the fact that as soon as historiography rises, encompassing this area immediately actually acquires a deeply important set of cultural references, anthropological, religious ones, and so on. That at that point descend essentially from mythology into history, and that gradually, in fact, unveiled the history of the dwellers of the Italian peninsula. I will use the term Italian to stress, like essentially the ensemble of concluded in the geographical dimension of Italy. As such, then, as you understand, this video is propedeutic. I don't know how I will have titled it, but surely we'll talk a lot about the Italics that, as you know, are the ones that effectively confer that specific, especially Indo-European identity to the peninsula, and from the heart of which Rome springs. Roman historiography itself is quite interesting. There is, as you know, because we often discuss this in other videos, a sort of perpetual whining about the terrible Romans having obscured the history of other peoples for some reason, which is largely untrue, meaning that if we largely know the history of a large part of Celtic history, for example, early Germanic one, etc., it's thanks to the Romans, Latin literature. This is very well known, even just in terms of Indo-Europeistics and comparative historical religious studies. We're all extremely thankful to the Romans for what they documented or not, in spite of the obvious boundaries that any historiography would have wanted to draw, and that, in fact, in this case, is more realistically culpable, guilty of having, in part, and actually obscured the history of the Italic peoples. Now, this term is this assessment is very controversial because, telling you the truth, the moment in which Rome takes over the Italian peninsula is still a moment in which Roman culture had not even properly developed a fully fledged literature on its own. This starts basically with the Punic War, and of course, when we look at the previous sources, more or less we see the Romans sharing a lot with not just the Latins specifically, but the other Italic groups. And also the other, as we've seen, these broader Italian ones that included Celts, included the Etruscans. We'll be talking a lot about those in particular. The same Greeks that thus also knew the Italics and the Italians. They were part of that. The Italiotes, right, and the Siciliotes. Even though, by the way, those Greeks did not write as much and as in depth as the Athenians, for example, do, or other authors did. So that already shades very much what I just said regarding the Romans. That, however, may have had an ulterior motive, especially in the later historiography, when they began themselves to be very highly qualitative in their storytellings of their own past, of their own land, to essentially, not necessarily obscure, willingly belittle, but not considering for a reason or another the naval history, because this is what we're talking about, that the maritime tradition of the Italic and the Italian peoples at the large. There's a very complex relation that the Romans have in their later historiography, say from the 1st century BC, with the Hellenic and Hellenistic world. In many ways, the Romans are the same creators of the narrative of alleged Roman coping, for example, an improvement that is, at least the latter part, true of other people's technologies, like what normally is today is used against the Romans in technologistic sense by people who hate Rome for some reasons, that the Romans copied everything from everybody as if they didn't have anything by themselves. Of course, we very well know that not just the Romans had a lot from a very early time, and we shouldn't actually make we shouldn't just think that the more technologically advanced you are, the more successful you are, but we shouldn't even presume that the more primitive you are, you don't necessarily have actually a pretty advanced technology. We've seen this, for example, in the development of early artillery, in the spread of literacy, things that surely pertain also to different influences. Hellenic engineers were the ones behind, however, still essentially Central Italian and specifically Roman employment of early artillery. When Alexander was there, and the Sicilians themselves were toying with this game. So I made a video specifically about that, but just for saying how actually complicated the story is. And it's as if Rome, however, going back to the relation with the Greeks, then naturally, because largely of the Alexandrine legacy, in fact, they were just the most important civilization after before the Romans took over themselves in the Mediterranean at that point in history, would have excluded basically other peoples that, especially by the point that same Roman historiography was writing, had been fundamentally Romanized. They had acquired full Roman citizenship, for example. We're talking the Italics. I care very much about this video and also its likely follow-up, because today we will look just a bit at the prehistory of it, right? So also even pre-Italic, pre-Indo-European periods, or while the Indo-Europeans were actually taking over the peninsula, that, as you know, is something that we know in a vast sort of ethno-anthropological, linguistic, genetic sense, but that, as in many other cases, not well documented, because archaeology does not have tags, because generally speaking, the inhabitants of the peninsula had not began to have, in fact, a literature on their own to the degree of telling us what was going on. We mostly have external observers. It's just like, I don't know, for the Vedas that, have that huge astronomical legacy in India, but we don't even, in their case specifically, we don't even have any real archaeological trace of them. We know they were there. And in general, we will see in the following videos instead what we can say about the Italics specifically. And so the naval activity that the Italics would have carried out in this post-Indo-European invasion, so by themselves, Indo-Europeans, that is perhaps a bit more disappointing. Meaning it's not like there is a hidden naval culture that the Italics were developing, inspired say, before being taken over by the Romans, surely they had a lot of potential there. You know that the Roman expansion at some point was potentially stoppable by especially the Oscan, the Samnite Confederacy and their allies, right? It would have really changed the history of the world, would have surely brought to some proper rise of an Italic identity at a more national level, but in a much more confederal sense compared to instead what Rome did as a city-state in a much more imperialistic fashion, as we know. Now, we'll talk about that because we already made some videos about the Samnites, but never fully delved into the actual archaic history of these peoples and their struggles with Rome. I made a couple of months ago a video about the Italic peoples, just listing the main ones, or so the smaller ones, just to say that who they were and how they, because pop culture does not seem to care more than much aside from those, total war units memes, like the notion probably of an Italic identity, culture, language, etc. And the fact that Rome was one with that is, in my opinion, underrepresented in the places like YouTube and consequently also a bit on the broader internet. This earlier part, instead, is probably the most fascinating because of the enormous amount of mythology that many of us also know, unbeknownst of the specific topic. As of course, may think about the Odyssey, for example, and how many Italian localities are actually part of that, and what kind of deep meanings are connected with it. In that case, as you know, the Odyssey is a bit more of a chthonic work compared to the Iliad. There is, in fact, likely already some kind of antiquary interest in a past that, however, had left these prepotent traces to be immortalized by, say, the Homeric work. It's important to acquire a consistent knowledge of these localities especially the communities that inhabited them, for an important series of reasons. First of all, I would say, starting from the secondary, as a matter of fact, we're a medieval history channel, and you know that I've made multiple videos explaining the Italian hegemony over the Mediterranean in the Middle Ages, most of the second part of the Middle Ages. Actually, a lot should be said about the first part, which we will likely do at some point as well. Some of you just asked me about the early age of Venice, right? And especially the rise, the incredibly systematic and as aggressive expansion of the lagoon city that was becoming at that point. And we observed how probably there is a whole lot of continuity that we have not even given for granted. Like, we were literally skipped at some point behind the notion that after the fall of the Roman Empire, all the West would have been some sort of nuclear wasteland of some sort, and that instead constantly reveals, year after year, especially on an archaeological basis, but just on the basis also of the documentary evidence that we have, that there was a radical continuity, especially in the Italian peninsula, concerning as far as that level of urbanism, of coastal dynamism, of trade connections, and naval power. We're talking essentially the most advanced military engineering of the era, to be found apparent from a strictly documentary point of view, apparently all of the sudden, as soon as the golden age of Islam faded, and so Pisa and Genoa began to kick ass across the Western Mediterranean. But that can not eventually have been born in the moment, right? And that raises question, not just because we know that, for example, the same Venice from a long time had very strong connections with Egypt. When you think about the Roman conquest of Egypt, it was not really that far away from those times. I mean, the Roman Empire was just a few centuries after the fall, so of a more comprehensively ecumenic, say, geographical say, understanding of the Roman Empire. And so it's wrong to presume that ties were cut, that this dialogue across the Mediterranean was basically just lost or overthrown or broken or whatever. The same can be said for antiquity, right? In my experience, I think that the archaic history of Rome and also the history of the Italic peoples is dramatically underrated as far as the actual development of these peoples was concerned. It's, again, difficult to discuss this because from one side you have the history of Rome that has been hyper sensationalized and popularized, mostly for the later centuries, but also almost sclerotized in the cultural, the imaginary, as some kind of entity on its own, just a city emerging from nowhere, as if the surroundings did not have a strong influence in the channeling of those forces that became the incredibly courageous Romano-Italic Confederacy, the one that resisted even to the bloodbath of Cannae, the most magnificent battle in the history of mankind, probably. And that stunned Hannibal, likely much more, in fact, than probably in its cohesion than the debacle had stunned the Romans and their allies. And there is something in this surrounding that, of course, is very much connected, as I said at the beginning, with the fact that Italy lays in the middle of the Mediterranean, and so it has an eminently maritime projection that was confirmed also by the rise of Rome, that surely happened also through naval power. And it was a naval power that from Italy the Romans were able to secure for centuries and centuries, like virtually annihilating piracy that restarts basically just from the crisis of the 3rd century after the exterminations of pirates that Pompey and Caesar had carried out. This is also evident in military technology. I mean, if we made a video about the Battle of Cape Economus, for example, one of the most important Roman victories over, especially the Carthaginians, that, as you know, were essentially the best sailors, at least in the Western Mediterranean, and that were knocked out by the Romans. Just like that, and some people said, "Oh, but you believe in the Corvus, whatever." But, first of all, I'm critical myself of the Corvus, but let's say in the mere fact that we are illustrating, first of all, a word that people take too much for granted through the explicit reference to something, right? It's like the Corvus. Why do we even consider it? Of course, because the sources describe it, and of course also because our, historians, scholars in general, basically doubt that it was this big deal, and I absolutely do myself. But we very well know that basically naval tactics at the time consisted largely in boarding, and so if the historiographical tradition of the era tells us that the Romans got like some kind of advantage, some levels of naval combat that entailed some kind of ingenious tactical mean. It's not much about what that would have materially been, but why would historiography have interiorized that? For a people like the Romans that were landlubbers, they weren't. This is the strongest point, actually, I forgot to make before, that the Italics are paradoxically largely continental and terrestrial peoples, right? So it's not to say that simply, even the fact that Italy had a very strong naval connection and had witnessed the Etruscans, the Carthaginians, the Greeks that were all famous sailors, and there were the Illyrians on the other side, that their strictly Italic backbone was a particularly navally adept one, right? And there is also a reason, because the Indo-European migrations, from which essentially by which the Italic backbone is demographically and in this sense also militarily substantiated, because they were warlike societies, did likely spread mostly across the Apennine. I made an entire video explaining this also, at least at the beginning of the video, about the Romano-Italic Indo-European identity. I properly discuss how we think also this Indo-European migration eventually would take the name of the land. This is also the case for the Latins within them, rather than knowing what their name were. They came from Central Europe, and there are also interesting questions of where did they actually come from, because it's possible that the Indo-Europeans of Italy came from two distinct directions. We surely know that there were different waves, but there was, in fact, a Balkan one, which is also witnessed by the fact that there were Illyrians in Italy, from probably what is today Apulia, for example, and probably a more central, if not northern European one, that some also wanted to associate with the Latino-Faliscans, so also with the Romans in substance. So the Oscans more like something having come from the Balkans. This is contentious because there is a proper evidence of this. There is a pan-Indo-European echo behind all of it. You know, we know it very well from the Romano-Italic religion, from of course, the same language, all the etymology. They had an incredibly and strikingly primitive, brutal, and pristine Indo-European identity. And it's shocking how much Rome was able to simply sublimate that in fulfilling the Indo-European evangelion of world domination. And I made, as you know, multiple videos on this topic. I will actually resume, not just the sort of history of religion episodes connected with this, but also likely something extra about properly like a broader history of the Europeans, right, of the Indo-Europeans of Europe, so to say. That, of course, passes very much to these peoples as well. So it goes without saying that there is a lot here, including what we'll see now in the form of what is notorious, if you are familiar with the history of the Sea Peoples, of the fact that there were lots of Italian peoples that participated to the so-called, in fact, like crisis of the Bronze Age, what would have been called like a Middle Ages in some specific regional contexts, that would have also overlapped with those early Indo-European movements and not. Right, we will talk about this now, and we understand, of course, that the Sea Peoples came largely from Europe, and from the very self-evident ethnonyms from Italy. And we're all aware, especially of the Nuraghe civilization, but there are properly references to otherwise other more properly Italian, other than Sardinian, components there that unfortunately are very difficult to track, to make a history of, a properly military or even operational one. Think about crossing the Mediterranean, or at least, going around like that. But that at some point we could try making, also as far as all the Hellenic, the history of the pre-Hellenic Middle Ages of something along that pattern. Today, we just stick mostly to this broader reflection and premise. So as you understood, and I think at some point I have to make a video for title, not dedicated to you, but to anyone who has that one, the difference between Roman, Latin, Italic, and Italian for dummies, right? Because you go out there on the internet, you encounter lots of people who have pseudo-historical interest, that they have, this, interest, this anxiety of appearing cultured or educated, and talking about Rome and the deep historiographical things. Sometimes they don't even know actually what's literally the difference between these terms. For example, an incredibly common mistake, we've seen it's a tendency really, especially in the US, in the video, in one of the last videos about the Q&A, that people confuse the Italic identity for the Latin identity. Right? Most people truly believe that when we think about the Romans, we're essentially looking at the Latin peoples taking over Europe. It's the Italic peoples taking over Europe, right? And the Latins were part of them, but the notion of the Italicness, properly, especially of the Oscan branch, but of the Italic people, is a bit like more dormant, and or like, by the way, historiography has tended by now to identify as Italic peoples that up to this point we tended to make a bit of mystery of, right? When we look at the Ligurians, the Veneti, the same Etruscans, the notion is a bit like for the Basques or this kind of people, like we don't know where they came from, whatever. But when you look at, especially because I don't know, people like the Ligurians at least straddled the Alps. They were a bit in Gaul and a bit in Italy, a bit in Po Valley. But in practice, what we're looking at with Italy, even for the Etruscans, is basically a Villanovian substratum with Indo-European conquest on. That include the Italics and the Celts, which are still basically the prevalent sort of what could be considered North Atlantic in genetic, conventional, simple genetical, conventional definitions, backbone, in fact, of the current Italian population. Now, so this is the basis. By Italics, we call the non-Hellenic and non-Etruscan populations of Italy, roughly speaking. There would be even other peoples, like, again, the Illyrians, etc., that were different in that case. But also, what does it really mean? Because there's been a sort of deconstruction of the notion that there was maybe, I don't know how this came, I don't know whether it was also an Italian thing after fascism, or also considering like the multiculturalistic approach to Rome and later thing, that there wasn't a solidly, Italic national backbone to the rise of Rome, and specifically of the Roman-Italic Confederacy, in fact. This is properly the national bulk that take over the empire. Right? It was an empire governing over other peoples across the Mediterranean in Europe, was this specific one, right? So it's important to recover that. Also, as a geographical space, of course, Italy is a very popular touristic destination. It has, in fact, marvelous sea, likely in terms of accessibility, the best in the world, between like natural and, I don't know, economical, business-based, etc., like political stability, etc., all combined. And that, in fact, is, really displayed all over the world. And, we don't use the postcards anymore, etc., but, when you go, I don't go, but I'm sure that on Instagram, the most typical thing about Italy is the scenario of some place on the Amalfi Coast, right? That is all of the sudden, what Italy should be a beautiful place. I've been there myself. They are great places, extremely rich in history, by the way, that few people care about. Also about the Middle Ages. We'll talk about that. I made a video about Amalfi, as a matter of fact, and myself, which is anecdotally also just yet another proof of that maritime inclination. But these magnificent places are also, in fact, hyper-loaded with a history that between, what do you think about Italy for normally? Rome, the Renaissance, right? But there is a lot of in between. As medievalists, we know that. But also before Rome, there is a world that it's not like shouldn't be like a localistic, but we were here before Rome, but it was an alternative culture that was supplanted or obscured. No, it's not that, as we were trying to explain at the beginning. It's something more complex. And it's something that properly predates even the same peoples that later would settle in a more demically concentrated sense, the properly Italic ones, that deserves to be analyzed. Also because the Indo-Europeans were around, and in fact, largely, as you know, also across Europe, we don't have strikingly precise timeline. We're talking around some centuries regarding which waves, if we can even trace them, etc. So probably we are belating the Indo-European infiltration in areas that, in fact, we think to have not been skated by those up to a certain point. Normally the Italic migrations occurred between, say, the end of the second. We're conventionally told between the end of the second millennium, the second and the beginning of the first millennium BC, right? And then things came to happen one way or another. There are, even antiquarianly speaking, very interesting chronological coincidences regarding mythology, like, for example, think about the foundation of Rome. Why did Varro have that kind of, like, it's all something that maybe in their time they would have had some kind of explanation for, at least putting together, even maybe in a mistake, some extra information that at the time was much more obvious and popular regarding what had actually happened back in the day, and that wasn't properly researched and told, of course, in the way we would be doing today. So most of the Italics we're taking in consideration to this mini series is mostly the Osco-Umbro-Sabellian triad, right? You know what peoples we're talking about. And in fact, the Oscans, I also simplify sometimes. I call just the Oscans and the Latinofaliscans. But of course, there was an Oscan group. It was mostly like central, southern Italian, mostly Adriatic. A Sabellian one that had basically made it into Latium from the Mediterranean watershed, and the Umbrians that in theory had also occupying the mountains of central Italy, contributed to that early migration that remained as a distinct group bordering the Gauls, the Etruscans, maintaining certain specific characteristics. For that matter, the Indo-European conquerors would have reached even Sicily, so that we think even the peoples of the Sicilian hinterland were actually Italics. In fact, Sicily always spoke Latin, regardless of the fact that people overly emphasize how, as if, southern Italy was Greek. No, right? Just like for all the Hellenic migration, let's say colonization, etc., like all over the Mediterranean, the Greeks were just on the coastline. The hinterland was native, right? Whether you talk the Scythians, the Gauls, etc., it's always the same pattern. The overwhelming majority of the population spoke a native tongue that was not Greek, right? This was true also later. The fact that the most important cities, of course, developed on the coastline because of the initial Hellenic migration is another story. That, of course, would make these places, we've seen it also in the early Middle Ages, connected with the Byzantine Empire, because they really spoke Greek. Just their elites had maintained some of that. But aside from the fact that they weren't univocally Greek cities, nor that real identity really existed, nor actually the traces, the 0.0 something percent of Greek speakers in Italy are an ancient legacy, but a medieval one, as a matter of fact, that is often overtly represented for some weird association between the Italians and the Greeks. They're truly different peoples, historically, culturally, linguistically, at the detriment, by the way, of much more important minorities in Italy historically. For example, the Albanians, that really date back to the Middle Ages there as well, or the Catalans in some parts of Sardinia. Let's leave aside the Germans in the sense that was more like Italy seizing German territories later on in the 20th century. But I don't know, also the Occitanians, the Ladins, and other groups are much more important actually than that virtually non-existent Greek legacy. This is very important. I think recovering the idea of the importance of the precision and especially of the difference of the divides between the Mediterranean peoples that are much wider than, for example, the ones between Northern Europeans, right, is crucial for a complete culture. Now, concerning the origins of these Italic tribes, we could even talk about them. There are scholarly works extensively documented this in a really good fashion since the 1960s. At least before I was complaining about the fact that probably there is not really a unified work comprehensively studying, tackling properly the topic of the Indo-European migration in a prehistorical sense, meaning, we have a lot of linguistic studies. We have a lot, because that's in many ways also just what, as I was saying at the beginning, we really have, right, to see how that Indo-European migration happened. But in fact, we don't know too much about the elemental parts of it. In fact, nothing. So it's even obvious that there isn't such a work trying. But it's strange that there isn't probably even one monography tackling the issue in a more comprehensive sense, even as a problem, right? Why we don't know it, but we could think it happened or didn't happen. In any case, for now, it is sufficient to highlight, regardless of this massive gaps in historiography, also in our own Western identity, that ancient texts that are at least what we really have, supported, of course, by archaeological and epigraphic evidence, recount the dispersal of these peoples from their ancestral homeland. Bear in mind, we're talking about the Osco-Umbro-Sabellians, so essentially either Umbria or Sabina, toward the Abruzzo Mountains, right? So basically, if you look at from a Roman perspective, it's all the Apenninic hinterland of Rome, in a broader sense. And a very strongly central Italian, in a non-also Tuscan sense, but probably the hardcore of what most of Romanity would have eventually stemmed from, at least considering that likely the same Latins had at some point come from similar directions to eventually, in fact, dwell in a more prosperous way compared to these mountaineers, right, of the hinterland. So we know that later some groups expanded also northward further and especially southward. This significant migration gave rise to the groups documented in historical periods that I also made a video about titled Italia Publica, that are the Gentes, the Pertutti, the Vestini, the Marrucini, the Paeligni, the Frentanians, the Samnites, the Apulians, the Bruti, the Lucanians, the Campanian Samnites, the Volsci, etc. Most of these groups had access to the coast. This is what we will analyze in another video better, because we know that they did have important military activities at sea, right? Strabo notes that even inland populations maintain trade routes primarily through river ports. That's yet another very underrated aspect in these people's cultures. The Allies in World War II knew better how many valleys exist, like one after the other, like throughout basically all southern Italy towards the north, without any major river, any major bigger plain. Right, in southern Italy there is scarcely any, but the riverways, of course, would have been particularly important to connect the upland, the highland mountaineers that mostly dwell, again, in pastures on plateaus, living out of cattle breeding. So this was the case especially of the Samnites, so the most consistent part of the Oscans, with, however, the sea. Because we're not talking enormously long distances, right? The Arno, the Po rivers are the longest in Italy, together with the Tiber one, by the way, that is, in fact, at that point, opening into Latium and greatly contributing to the development of Rome as a city. But if you look at the other central and southern Italian rivers, these are fairly short. Right, so also the distances, it's true that they would have been less important in this sense as an actual mean of communication with the sea, but they're also fairly small distances, so it's unthinkable that the Italics would have not had some kind of broader connection through these rivers. By the way, as you know, the main struggle between these mountaineers and the coastal civilizations, because as we explained, there is not really much of a lowland, especially in southern Italy, so where most of the Oscans were concentrated, were well exemplified by, as we were saying before, as we distinguished the Samnites of the hinterland with the Samnite Campanians, essentially the Capuans in particular, that had sort of gentrified and urbanized, and in fact even called the help of Rome, even though during, as you know, the Second Punic War, they opened the gates to Hannibal, and eventually they got essentially what they deserved after the end of the war. So it was a very conflictual relation, to say the least, one that witnessed a lot of warfare, right? That also in part triggered the rise of Rome, because just as we were talking about yesterday for the 4th century BC, the other day, about the Concordia Ordinum, you know that the Romans begin to attack peoples like the Aequi, the Volsci, because they were beginning to try to exploit some Latin weaknesses. And at that point, Rome fully militarizes, fully opens to the plebeians, the imperial magistracies, and so the chameleon legion starts being geared up and starting to steamroll all these peoples. Like, I don't know, the Romans were at some point 137 years at war in 150. So we're talking, again, a granitically militaristic reality that was the only one that could also cope with this pretty irreverent and wild peoples of the hinterland. It would be interesting to compare, for example, the level of development of the Italics compared to, I don't know, the one of the Iberians or the Celts, because indicators suggest that the Italics, aside probably also from the coastal ones that were more influenced by the Etruscan and the Hellenic models, had already a significant amount of pre-urban development, right? And that, again, Italy was likely more advanced than we think. It was really conventionally understood as a very rich place, regardless of the early days and the lack of political cohesion, right? And this is also what would confer Rome an incredible force. Now, scant evidence remains of the Italics' interaction with the sea, which, in fact, likely wasn't enormous. Or certainly wasn't enormous, but still not insignificant, right? And this is where the historical problem begins, because we have some late accounts likely derived from sailors' stories and legends, often woven into myth. We'll mostly look at this. And even for times, by the way, where the Italics were not necessarily quite there, we were also probably not really aware whether at the time they would have really acquired their own tribal profiles, because we're still talking, even for the Indo-European peoples, of things like Proto-Italic, because again, some of them were just migrating at that point, or even Proto-Celts, Proto-Germans, and so it's useless to talk about attentively, I don't know, the Latins, the Samnites. We literally don't have an idea of how they came into being. They simply settled there. It's mostly they were divided by initial, identities that eventually were reinforced by the local settlement and so on. It's evident why, I don't know, the Latins existed with that well-outlined identity. And they dwelled, in fact, in the lower Tiber Valley. It was particularly fertile with that volcanic terrain and, all the blessings of nature there. And the Oscans were more, again, on the Apennine, interland, highland cattle breeders. They were, however, also fairly similar. As we explained before, the fact that you're more developed under certain points of view doesn't really mean that, I don't know, especially in this phase of ancient history, differences were so drastic, right? We can outline them with a certain degree of precision because of course, in fact, mostly the detailed history of the Roman conquest of Italy, etc., but we understand that we're pretty much like the same people at the end of the day, speaking de facto the same language. We find brief references of this Italic maritime activity in the Hellenic periploy. Essentially, these were descriptions of coastal sanctuaries, right? What did the Greeks care about? It wasn't merely about trade or finding a right place where to found a new colony, but really, what kind of forces existed that controlled the coast? This religious element is key to understanding the actual political and military power existing on the coast, because they went into parallel. Sanctuaries weren't merely random places. There are some. There's the Avernian Lake. There is the Umbrian Forest, etc. That are incredibly old sanctuaries, right? Think about how the Mont Saint-Michel, for example, is twinned with the same Saint Michael Archangel in Mount Saint Angel. That would be exactly the former see of the Umbrian Forest. It was a sacred one in the typical Italic tradition during Longobard times on the Gargano Peninsula in Apulia. It later was taken over by the Normans that further reinforced that tradition. We will talk more about military saints to understand how ancient actually the continuity of these cultural locations and practices really were. Roman historians Hellenic geographers and Pliny the Elder provide generally limited details about the Italic naval horizons, though. Thus, research must piece together clues from the scarce archaeological remnants of coastal or port settlements, as well as polyonyms and toponyms that have survived, often cryptic or difficult to pinpoint. And even more complex are the myths of colonizing heroes, seafaring refugees, and records of relics of ancient sanctuaries. Think about, the entire Aeneid is basically about this. And in fact, not much like the Odyssey, that is more like an epic thing in comparison to that, beautiful chant of Indo-European identity. But in fact, something that punctuates the history, especially of Italy, with certain identities, memories that, as we've seen, were also very potently Indo-European. As I explained again in that video about the Romano-Italic Indo-European identity, I give you all the actual, also phenotypic descriptions of people like with cameras, fulvous in hair, like you have blondes everywhere. Aeneas is supposed to have had white hair for how blonde platinum they were. So it's something really insane, and in that sense very well recorded and interiorized into Roman, probably also at the time of Virgil. So regardless of course, of the reworking of all the various legions, there was a very arcane knowledge connected with those early movements that are not merely random, like how you learn them in school about the story of the single hero, etc. No, they are telling you in a sort of more in a more easily accessible way, so to say, more entertaining fashion, like movement, hinting at least at the movements of peoples, of war bands, of demigods, of that they are typical. By the way, the Bronze Age of that was going on, especially in the age of the sea peoples. This is all what these guys were doing around. And of course, again, who controlled the coasts was more powerful. Right? This is true in general. I would say in the broader history of the Indo-European peoples. Like if you look at the Dorians, there is no doubt that in Europe, from a strictly Indo-European point of view, these were by far the most successful conquerors, because and this is parallel, paradoxically, by that Hellenic mentality that sees Greece as the center of everything, starting from the Oracle of Delphi, the Omphalos of the world, and the entire, say, probably the pure action-based sense of the hero that is something so transcendentally outlined, unlike in naturally what were later documented mythologies like the Roman or the Germanic ones or the Celtic ones. The Celtic especially had a lot of chthonic elements, pre-Indo-European elements. But in this hierarchy, also, in fact, the Italic tradition, with Rome in particular, and her capacity to revive that, even fairly late after the conquest, is utterly shocking. Right? So all these stories, unfortunately, will never likely ever be deciphered and sorted out, but in fact mean so much more than what we're normally habituated to think them like, just because of the obvious scarcity of evidence for something more articulated. A key difficulty lies in separating historical reality from the image painted by sparse and terse sources. Hellenic historians typically portrayed inland peoples as consistently hostile, fierce, numerous, and belligerent, periodically raiding the Magna Grecian coastal cities as far as that was concerned. Let's remember that, Syracuse was literally the strongest Hellenic polis at some point in history. So this is very interesting and important. First of all, this is very common to all the Hellenic stories. They went by sea, and they encountered, as we were saying, the Scythians, the Thracians, the Illyrians, the Gauls, etc., the Libyans, and so on. So, of course, these were considered in that Hellenic mentality all kind of barbarians. As you know, the Italians, the Italics, later the Romans, were at some point almost adopted as Greece in the moment in which she was taken over by Rome, sort of recognized that the Romans were essentially not mere barbarians by that point. But of course, the older myths, right? So again, what is ancestrally recorded as more like legend than factual history characterizes, of course, also the Italian hinterland as exactly that from an Hellenic coastal perspective. Magna Graecia, which is a Latin term by the way, so probably the Italiotes, the Siciliotes, the Hellenes of southern Italy prospered dramatically. These polis were fortified by advanced Hellenic culture, organization, and tactics, but they also developed traits, features on their own, including the fact that were a bit more warlike, right? They had distinct characteristics, as we said before with Syracuse, that developed essentially a monarchic power that was not really proper of the typical Hellenic polis, exactly for reasons of external hostility. The fact that the populace, in that case, was mostly about Carthage from Africa, but think about, we've seen, for example, how Pyrrhus was called by the Hellenic polis of mainland southern Italy, namely Taras, a Spartan, one that gave him dramatic logistical, also military support against whom? Against the Italics, against the Lucanians. There were lots of different peoples with advanced tactics, consistent cavalry. Like the Italy is not really the best place where in absolute you can have the finest cavalry in absolute terms, but cavalry was actually fairly advanced, and I also made a video debunking those myths that would like to make you believe essentially the Romans weren't good at horsemanship. There was probably a moment in which a feudal Roman existed, and the various patrician clans in their mobsters' life were incredibly equestrian based, and this is, by the way, notorious if you also know the Roman sagas, for that matter. We'll keep talking about Roman archaic cavalry. So these polis could not be essentially the same of the Hellenic motherland, right? And in fact, what we think as classical Greece is, let's be honest, it's not even Greece. It's just Athens and Sparta, right? Which also, historiographically speaking, is pretty obvious. So it's not like we have a dramatic Tarentine or Crotonese or Syracusan tradition. Maybe the latter a little bit, because it was more stimulated in Sicily in the midst of lots of interesting things all around, and even more navally projected. But about the same Italic peoples, because after all, we explained that the Greeks didn't go much further inland at all, right? A few tens of kilometers inland, it was Italic territory, and again, no Greek basically cared about any kind of military expansion in that direction. In Hellenistic times, admittedly, with Pyrrhus himself, that was a dream, but mostly it was about taking over Carthage, creating a sort of a launch pad for taking over what had been Alexander's, and eventually going over to India, because this is basically what all the Diadochoi really want to follow the Megas on the Megas' footsteps, including the Romans, by the way. That's what Augustus wanted, just to make an example of what Caesar wanted. So, and by the way, it's notorious that these Magno-Grecian polis often had to summon military leaders from their homeland for support, right? At some point on the coastal side, for example, the Veneti at some point famously defeated the Spartans. Some illustrious leaders were killed in the Italic hinterland. So it's really a brutal picture that unfortunately is as scarcely documented as likely very bloody in that regard, in interest of probably the individual communities. Likewise, Roman historians depict the Samnites and related groups as rough dwellers of the mountainous interior. The Latins said literally montani et agrestes, which in fact means mountaineers, and rustics, warlike and tenacious, fundamentally primitive. in part disorganized, in part uncivilized. Especially the latter two adjectives are not quite the case. I made a video, for example, about the Battle of Suez, that is very famous historiographically for many reasons, but that was also interesting politically because you had essentially, this was during the Latin Wars and in between the Samnite ones, and here the Romans are allied with the Samnites against the Latins. And it's very interesting because they were at that point to be put on the same level, also as far as the spoils, so because of their coalition eventually won over the Latins, and in Suez, and so there was all an issue between the allies saying who was actually who had really won the battle, right? Each on their side of the array. This very to whom like the spoils of war really went. This is not just important for the economies of these people, but of course for the religious meaning of these clashes, right? There's all the story of Decius Mus, again, another brilliant example of equestrian military culture between the Latins and the Romans that, again, are basically the same people at a provincial level. There, you don't see much naval stuff going on. If you look at the details, there is something here and there, but it's an overwhelmingly terrestrial dimension. There is no doubt that the Oscans were more primitive and less developed than the Romans by that point. However, they looked pretty much similar, and they were basically of the same mold. As you know, so later, essentially, these peoples would become Roman legionnaires themselves. It's that rough Italic backbone. It also would maintain that necessary pinch of warlike, warrior, individualistic character in the also incredibly and violently disciplined, collectively disciplined Roman soldiery. Now, the narrative crafted by the victorious Romans using new terminology primarily chronicles the Italic defeats, and to some extent perpetuates the outdated Magno-Grecian depiction of protohistoric and archaic Italy as an unknown land inhabited by crude, savage people along coasts riddled with natural and human threats. This is very important. The Romans were to look more familiar to the Greeks during their rise in Mediterranean in order to render their rule more tolerable to the Hellenes. Again, it's an antiquarian exercise. It depends also, of course, on about which authors we're talking about, because literally a 4th century BC Roman would have not even began to think this specifically. They may have seen it coming, but they would have not described at the time these peoples. And in fact, that's the point. When we talk about the Roman sagas, this was the overwhelming oral tradition of the great Roman heroes and wars and battles, etc., that eventually we get to know because of authors like, Livy. Truly knew them in that sense and made a video explaining this as far as the birth of Rome, like the foundation of Rome is concerned. There is an overwhelmingly Catholic and Indo-European meaning to the rise of the twins, of the wolf, of the mountain, of the lowland. It's all there. It's something shocking in its brutal beauty. So it's unfortunately a set of sources that we can't access anymore only through this mediated fashion, and also in a way that is probably predictably showing, of course, the Romans as winners, but obviously the defeated as those who didn't have many other features to oppose to the Romans other than something very similar to what the Latins themselves also were. The islands and peninsulas of Italy are described often in the legends of the ancient world as having shores teeming with beasts or monsters. I mean, these are very famous. Think about Polyphemus, right? It's a prototype of a monster. By the way, he's a herder. He has his sheep. As you know, he's immense, right? He has only one eye, which is a sort of it would have been actually a more traditional concept than we think in origin, but in that legend specifically, it's also like a lack of vision, rather. and Scylla and Charybdis, right? Obviously, that also at that point mixing the geographical and climatological element, everything of the straits between Sicily and the Italian mainland were incredibly perilous for the sailors. But not only, we're talking probably rapacious pirates that nested exactly in those places. If you think about the Mamertines later, the Mamertines we mostly remember them just because they seized Messina and they, as you know, were becoming proteges of the Romans that used them as casus belli to enter Sicily against Carthage, etc. But who were these people? These were the typical Indo-European Italic war bands of the interland that had been going around controlling, seizing this. Also evidently in a coastal reality, crossing properly from the Italian mainland in a maritime fashion, a pirate-like fashion. These are the same war bands of antiquity. We've seen that a lot for the Celts. That are sort of more stereotypically about that. But say the Italics had stopped doing that themselves from actually a very recent time. And actually this is the same continuation of it, together with, I don't know, the Italics that fought, for example, against Rome in the service of Carthage or of the Macedons, etc. So the legions, coming from also much older times at that, show not just this rough nature, but in the powers of Italy. Think about, I don't know, the same volcans, the same. It's a very seismic area as well, so it was associated with incredibly powerful telluric forces, right? This is something that goes on throughout the Middle Ages. Think about the vision of Frederick II that rides in his death together with his knights into the mouth of the Etna volcano, and that is connected also with this idea of the absconditus king, like it is. It happened also for Barbarossa, for King Arthur. Right? You know, they're somewhere in a palace in the netherworld, ready to reemerge at some point. But of course, these legions speak of semi-wild populations waiting to endanger seafarers. That's the most obvious meaning of the same. For example, Capri and Pithecusa. This is some, again, of the most famous. Also, the first is an especially touristic area. Pithecusa is also very close to Cumae, to Cape Misenum, to the Lake Avernus. All these places that were incredibly old and as such connected with equally legendary religious powers from a very long time. These places take their names from animals. Specifically, Capri is like the capper, is the goat, of course. Pithecusa has to do with monkeys. This is interesting. Some of these animals existed also, like, I don't know, lions up to Augustan times, like places like Italy and Spain, so we could find them in the countryside. Yet, like Ischia, these places were inhabited since antiquity and visited by the Hellenes and Tyrrhenians. So even though associated with animals, it's likely that these animals were, especially if you think about the goats, were sustaining some kind of local community of some importance that had, by the way, in these locations, very important strategic control over choke points, straits, the coasts, right? And so being able to intercept the enemy, the seafarers' vessels, and they're stealing their cargoes and their supplies and so on. Compounding this, the shores are lined with deadly lakes as well. We were just saying it, veritable portals to Hades, such as the ominous Avernus, linked to the underworld, or bewitched, intoxicating springs likened to outlets of the Styx. Italy's cliffs and promontories are ruled by alluring but hostile deities, capable of unhinging sailors, right? The semi-savage sirens and the enchanting Circe, who could transform men into pigs, by the way. So this is very interesting because it speaks of a pre-Indo-European feminine, chthonic, telluric force, right? Dionysian almost aphrodisian element that ensnares even the greatest of heroes, as you know also from the Odyssey. Beyond these striking figures, the island and coastal peoples are portrayed as ferocious, teetering between humanity and bestiality in their ways. The Laestrygonians, cannibalistic giants akin to Polyphemus and his kin, uproot trees and boulders, wreck ships, and are placed in Sicily or near Formia, in the south of Rome, spanning the lower Tyrrhenian region. This info is very interesting. These people eat others alive. So human sacrifices were, as you know, very common all over the Indo-European world. So there is a proper cult of blood in all of decapitations, in particular in all the continental Europe, like the Germans, the Celts, the Italics. They all do that, right? It's a very strongly indicative thing. Here, these guys shatter ships as well. And surprise, surprise, they're located on coastal areas that, of course, would have been, again, the ones that the Greeks would have only ventured to, but that obviously are living on the sea. Otherwise, they could not reach those same ships, and immediately they engaged them also on water. But that also populate the hinterland, right? How different, especially with these characteristics, could have the hinterland populations been? The prophetic Sibyl held sway near Cumae, while Hephaestus labored amid the shrieks and sulphurous fumes of the burning or Phlegraean fields. Home to the Cimmerians, ghostly humans dwelling in sunless caves. The Phlegraean fields, by the way, are still giving, that there is a brudisismic phenomenon that goes on for millennia. They're still giving problems of people living in places like Baia, Pozzuoli, in those very areas. And you understand here how, regardless of the darkness, again, of the chthonic symbolism, how much of divine and of unknown and of some of hidden forces these legends reveal about the Italian coastline, right? Naturally, most of the stories revolve around the Tyrrhenian because it was the richest part, the one with, in fact, even the longer coastline, but also the more sort of articulated one, with also more volcanoes, more fractal territory that could help like the broader strategic complexity of the place. The Adriatic was poorer, was smoother also in a sense, so it was not much of a better place to go to, but that's, in fact, the Tyrrhenian was what the Greeks preferred. If they had to be killed, it was better to go there. At least you saw some better places and you had more chances of getting something out of it. Even along the Adriatic, however, barbaric pirates, ever vigilant, persist like animals in dens built from shipwreck debris. As Strabo, for example, describes in his account from the peak of the historical era, by the way. So these stories were not written, again, in the earlier eras. Yes, they stem from much older sources. There were a very strong continued tradition passing down this information, but fundamentally we're talking in a time which Rome was peaking in power. And so these were the same Italians that had conquered other cultures, etc. Of course, these were considered as antiquities, as legions, as areas that historically had imagine like the same Italics probably would have had, in fact, a lot to say regarding those legions. We know mostly this through the Hellenic filter, right? The Romans, the Italics, didn't even talk so much themselves about it because it was part of their own legions, of their own entity. I mean, we find this pretty much all over the world, but again, if they're not written by a famous ancient scholar, who's really going to know about them, right? In essence, Italy's coasts seem both captivating and terrifying, governed by fearsome semi-divine beings and inhabited by a primitive, beastly humanity, occasionally cannibalistic, by the way. deemed barbaric and inferior in some way. They are even criticized for daring, after seizing Hellenic coastal cities, to wed Hellenic women, right? So they're really considered, ideally, at least this is a bit of a straw man reality. Again, this really belongs even to an age where the world was in fact not taken over by the Indo-Europeans, and so monsters obviously inhabited the world, and the great heroes had sort of tamed that. So we're not necessarily even talking about the earliest Italics here. It's more like probably also much older traditions. God knows really where did they really stem from, that we find in this narrative that must be understood also in that anthropological sense, and likely we will do so even better when talking again about ancient mythology. By the way, the coasts and promontories in these stories often lack proper names, instead taking them from Hellenic heroes lost at sea, right? Such as Palinurus, or buried like Bius, Ulysses' steersman and namesake of Baia, in fact, or Misenus, the Trojan fleet's trumpeter who died near the Cape, named after him. And it's quite appropriate that eventually the Augustan imperial fleet would be stationed there, at least a part of it. The other was in Ravenna. But think about how much even a Roman emperor would care about this earlier symbolism attached to this. And again, mostly through the Aeneid at that point as a more Italic tradition, but still famously connected also to the Hellenic one, and the various heroes that, after all, like just the ones from Troy, had surely so much to do with the same Italic ancestry to a degree, especially during the end of the Bronze Age. These heroes, who survived countless battles, adventures, and dangers, perished, by the way, at sea. And especially while navigating Italy's shores, or sometimes after a reckless landing. So these Italian coastlands were not particularly auspicious. They were dangerous. There was evidently a lot to get from them, but at high risk, both for the peoples inhabiting them and the general difficulties of navigation. By the way, they were also geographically distant, right? They were less accessible to an extent. It was really entering another world. By the way, the aforementioned figures dying on the Italian coast gave rise to such toponyms with, for example, Diomedes standing out for naming islands, founding cities, and establishing a kingdom. At least from this Hellenic perspective, there is, of course, through the obvious massive Hellenic colonization of much of this, especially southern sector, an idea of civilization, right? The fact that the Greeks had come to properly give names to an unfamiliar and perilous land, as the typical Indo-European hero of that provides with that identity, just through vision and sheer will to power, after having surpassed a perilous trial. According to such legends, the Italics ruled a land encircled by the sea, yet dangerous for those who sail for trade or adventure, compelled to land by storms, necessity, or the promise of gain. As it was also the most obvious motivation behind these activities. This mythical and occasionally geographic narrative, useful to navigate the followers of these path openers, should naturally be stripped of stereotypes, allegories, pseudo-etymologies, and corrections, both ancient and modern, and enriched with archaeological evidence. This is not what I do for a living. I'm not a philologist nor an archaeologist. However, from a historical point of view, we are the ones that, in fact, these guys have to work for. Eventually we have to be the ones who decide the matter. That's the advantage of being a historian in many ways. Now, in truth, the Italic peoples were engaged themselves in navigation since ancient times. in prehistoric and protohistoric periods, think the trade of obsidian from the Aeolian Islands and Iberian tin and copper, right? We often think, again, there's this pro-Celticistic attitude. Oh, look, the Celts, they had trade routes all across the continent. Well, yeah, because what did our peoples really have, and especially at sea, right? But nobody ever says, oh my God, look at, I don't know, this Italian peoples had this at the time. No, but this is a bit like, I don't know, for the Middle Ages as well. How much have you actually been ever told through conventional education even about the centrality of the Italian community, not just because of the maritime republics, but what these actually were in a political, military, or social sense, right, compared to the major kingdoms in Western Europe, even though they earned literally more than those. So it's very complicated to especially look at all the history that has been written, simply say, okay, we'll have to not necessarily rewrite it, but at least even in our own cultural understanding, simply try to see beyond the stories. I mean, of the Iliad, of the Odyssey, of the Aeneid, simply, with a bit of a more critical lens. It's complicated because it's not just about the historical difficulty, but it's how much the way which we have been taught the stuff that sort of sticks to us and is more familiar, right? Now, when you look at those ancient circuits, in very old times, you realize that the goods traded may have been carried, of course, by foreign ships. But the legendary migration of the Ausones, so what are conventionally understood as the Italians, the Italian inhabitants, to the Aeolian Islands, for example, implies actually the same Ausones' deep knowledge and command of seafaring. And we've seen also how the Virgilian tradition connects the Ausonians even with, for example, red hair, right? And so at that point, you must understand, like, who were actually these people? We see early Indo-Europeans here at work as well. And so, again, that is already a later tradition from within a semi-Indo-European narrative, but if you overlap these different sources, you realize that even though all those monsters from the Italian coastlands were probably quite warlike populations that surely would have been also present before the Indo-European conquest, but that at this point were being further reinforced. And through the history of deeds, of heroes, of noble lineages, and so on. In fact, the evidence also challenges the simplistic view of an Italy antagonistic to navigators and detached from maritime activity. Here, of course, we must talk about the Etruscans. They are the major elephant in the room. Pliny reports, in fact, that the Tyrrhenians invented the anchor with flukes, stock, and crossbar, which, as a claim, was recently validated by the wreck of the of a 6th century BC Etruscan ship of Cap d'Antibes. We are in Provence, in southern France, where a lead anchor stock, the earliest known, was found. We really have to talk more about the Etruscans on Schwerpunkt, because I had the impression that we really didn't expand too much on how crucial these were as catalyzers of the same, probably Italic identity. Because again, we decided that these guys were not Italic, were not Indo-European, but again, largely they actually were. All right, they were Villanovians with Indo-European, say, grafts, let's say, and again, wherever they came from, it doesn't quite matter, right? As you know, also if you take the easternmost options, times like Anatolia was largely Indo-European itself, so we're talking mostly elites, where actually also the bulk of the people was always within the same space, and it's not like, I don't know, in Etruria, people were radically different from, say, Latium or Campania. right? That's also why the Etruscans greatly expanded along the coast. Yes, there were important differences. The same Latins were, compared to the Etruscans, those sort of more primitive, warlike, and more demographically and culturally self-evidently Indo-European groups, and so allegedly less sophisticated and less capable of navigating, etc. This is in part also true, right? But one should always be careful to, in the meanwhile, because this is a very early stage in civilization. It's not like since the first ones emerged in the, some millennia before Christ, these newcomers were so practically distant. Like civilization was really something very new, and especially to these places, and also most of them all around, aside from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and so on. So this is very fascinating. You know that the Etruscans had very strong connections also through continental Europe with the Norse, essentially. Likely the Futhark developed largely in parallel with the contacts with the Etruscans and their alphabet, also in Northern Europe. So it's really a cross-European phenomenon. You can't detach the coastland of Italy, say, from, the Baltic ones, aside from the Amber Road that crossed literally the continent. It was a great part of this mechanisms as well. There is, properly an interland, a continental one, that was likely much more similar to each other than we tend to think. So the aforementioned naval technological finding of Captain Tiba lends greater credence to another of Pliny's claims, that the Etruscans were the first to fit ships with a ram, right? It's interesting how, again, also from the Middle Ages, you have the peasants literally in the same Tuscany of the Etruscans or the Genoese that controlled the same Provençal coastline. As soon as this, that Italian naval power was reactivated through the pages of history, it is thus clear and indisputable that during the archaic period, advancements in maritime technology and naval warfare were led by a major non-Hellenic Italian people, the Etruscans, who controlled the sea named after them, the Tyrrhenian Sea. It's interesting because the Etruscans also have their own so-called orientalizing phase, which was largely drawing, in fact, from Greece, in their east. This tells you also how fairly, of course, aware, first of all, of Hellenic culture they were, but how they, in this Eastern connection, still saw themselves as peoples who had both to gap that distance, but also were likely also had been exposed to that, in their origin of whichever clans they had historically belonged to in the past. They understood the inherent potential, so to become actually the most advanced naval power at that point, probably ever, in Mediterranean. So this aspect, in fact, is also probably underrated. The fact that the Western Mediterranean is less documented doesn't mean necessarily that, for example, this was less navally developed than the East in some ways. And again, it's not just about the Carthaginians. The Etruscans, as you know, also hotly contend the sea to the Phoenicians that had something or two to say about navigation. But again, it's just like in later times, how much do you know from the Latin world, as opposed, in literally speaking, as opposed to the Hellenic one, still at the peak of the Roman Empire, right? You understand how the levels of development are not necessarily directly proportional, for example, to the development of a proper historiography. Just as the Etruscans significantly influenced the Latins of Latium and Roma, they also impacted coastal populations. Hellanicus of Lesbos confirms, for example, in the Homeric era, so pretty early in time, that the Tyrrhenians were adept sailors traversing the seas with swift ships. Even Egypt, with its ancient and formidable civilization, faced heavy raids or invasion attempts, notoriously in the late 2nd millennium BC, exactly when the Italics started to pop up, from peoples arriving by fleets. At that time, entire fleets could transport sizable military forces and possibly entire communities seeking new homes as well. Right? And this is really also another aspect that is often underrated, how the northern shores of the Mediterranean have always been overwhelmingly more gravid of manpower than the southern ones. Right? Basically, take away Egypt. North Africa has been overwhelmingly more impacted historically by the genetics, demographics, and more culture, etc., than anything that North Africa ever did to the northern shores of the Mediterranean, that were overwhelmingly way more populated. Right? So this is yet something, again, the narrative of the Saracens during the Middle Ages. At some point, the Saracens arrived. In the 19th century, there were some racistic and socially Darwinistic notions that, had to explain why, for example, Italy had historically declined. Apparently, during the Middle Ages or after the time of the Saracens, that's not really the case, because that after the Italians really took over the Saracens at sea and became one of the most overwhelmingly advanced civilizations in the history of mankind. But the notion that it would have been genetically polluted by Africans, and so from a genetical point of view, that's actually not shown. But it would be self-evident just by the radical disparity of demographic density of the two. I mean, North Africa is mostly a strip, right, of inhabitable land with desertic, semi-desertic interland, right, of peoples that also did largely not go by sea, because there were still others that controlled the coastlines and fought against them, and yes, could use them, but, the same goes much more for the north. So even during the migration era, as you saw with the Vandals that settled in Africa, or the same Slavs that at some point arrive in Greece, pick a boat and go over to North Africa, right? The Romans themselves, the Romans are just, again, the fulfillment of that Italic evangelion in terms of conquest of the gravid, feminine, telluric Egypt. That is the greatest prey of this older, decadent old and decadent civilization. The Romans pick even their obelisks and take them to Rome, etc. The idea of the northern conqueror that arrives in ships, right? It's just like the Lohengrin and the Knight of the Swan. It's just repeating itself over and over and over again in the Indo-European history, and it's something that we've never sort of been told. Right, and we have lots of silly distractions, like, nobody cares, rightly. I mean, you should be happy about the fact that the Romans, the Greeks conquered, for example, the Levant. They conquered Egypt. That's completely normal. Nobody has a beef with that. All of a sudden, the Crusades are a terrible thing because the Europeans did the same exact thing that they did in the past. But since, the post-traditional world is like, the Bible is kind of bad, whatever, for some reason, that becomes a problem, right? And of course, we live in a world of a radically under-educated lesser people, and that's obviously a point. But just, a bit of decency and, if anything, for the same dignity of human intelligence would actually be proper. And the sea peoples are exactly that one, right? As likely in the same clash, the Philistines, like the clashes with the Israelites, David versus Goliath. It's the latter is likely an Indo-European conqueror, and it's interesting, in fact, also how these peoples related with one another. Because David has to shoot with his link this guy from the distance. Titus Manlius Torquatus has to take out the goal, like really, stabbing him in the bowels in close combat. So that's a completely different cultural perspective between not just, well, in that case, you're saying you can make the stereotypical divide between Indo-Europeans and Semites, but it's something that really, the more you study European history, the more you realize how solidly ingrained we are, also in a military sense, and how easy it is to us with the right trigger to simply start and go conquer other places. It feels so natural and obvious that I don't know even what could or would there be of more proper and fulfilling. Pharaohs Merneptah and Ramesses II were tasked with first fighting and then repelling with considerable effort the diverse, apparently multicultural horde of pirates, landing forces, and armed migrants known as the Sea Peoples. Possibly through coordinated efforts, or more likely driven by emulation, fueled by tales of successful raids with rich plunder and the recognition of Egypt's weakened state, a varied group of predators attacked Egypt by sea. The accounts of the triumphant pharaohs preserve their names. They are so incredibly telling. They're probably one of the single most telling feature of Bronze Age ethnography. Who are these peoples? Who are the Sea Peoples? Eventually tamed by the Egyptians, regardless of their intrusions and misdeeds. The Dardani, the Tusha, the Luca, the Akavasha, the Sheklesh, and Sherden. Now, these are Egyptian names, but in spite of the possible variety in interpretations, it's self-evident that we're talking about the Dardanians, the Tuscans, the Tusha, the Lucas, the Lycians, the Akavashas, the Achaeans, the Sheklesh as the Sicels, so the Sicilians, and the Sherden as obviously the Sardinians. All right, this is incredibly important. Of course, lots of things were going on at sea at this time, right? And so we do not say when you're saying like here Sardinia, Sicily, the Tuscany, so to say, we may not exactly know who these peoples were, right? Whether the Sardinians, the Sicels more than else, the Sicani, the Tyrrhenians were already established in their historical Italian territories by this point. However, the chronology is suggestive here of an actual arrival of these and of a fresh sort of manpower and enterprising mentality that was obviously heading towards their strategic projection as far as this, decadent giant of civilization like Egypt was at the close of the Bronze Age. So why is it interesting? Because it's plausible that during the Sea Peoples invasions, there were lots of actual Italic peoples, proto-Italics if you want, so not necessarily the Etruscans, right? Or the Sardinians. Sardinia has nothing to do with Italy historically in a proper sense, nor ethnically, nor linguistically. It's a completely different thing. It's studied anthropologically as a different country. We're talking properly the Italics. And we think, in fact, the European peoples may have served as crewmen, for example, or marines, obviously, on, for example, the ships of more advanced rulers like the Etruscans, whoever they actually were, and likely they were also, co-opting so many of these Europeans if they were not Indo-European themselves, therefore sharing risks and rewards. And so actually, this would speak, if true, of a major Italic participation to massive expeditions for the time in places, to pretty very far away and advanced places like Egypt, the Levant, etc. We can easily even think of Italic vessels at that point sailing alongside the Etruscan ones. Naturally, this time in history, again, the close of the second millennium BC is so far and distant that given how scarcely we know even about, the mid-first millennium BC Italics, may make this whole story sound fairly speculative, and in any case, not fully demonstrable. But if you really think about the factors involved, the peoples that were around, and that it's not like in later Italy there were other groups that, for some reason, would have spawned at different times, would have been overlapping, but they were basically the same, right? That existed later. Like, it's fair to assess that the Italics had actually a very interesting past of naval warfare as far as Egypt during the collapse of the Bronze Age civilization, or the presumed one. Again, that's also hotly contended. Probably something of that kind did happen anyway. I've seen too many of these things historically not to pretend that but it was not really a collapse. But yeah, it was in any case a major civilizational shrinking and remolding to some extent. Surely characteristics in its own way, but not less true in those fundamentals. Even in the archaic period, and certainly in historical times, mercenarism, we know it very well, we mentioned it before, brought Italics to Africa, for example. This is indicated by some sources and confirmed by the Samnite armor from Bardo, for example, Tunisia. That's also kind of obvious because of Carthage, of Hannibal, of the fact that, again, many Italians found an employment in the armies of the rich oligarchs of Carthage, of Carthage. Not only those, we've seen even Italic settlers in the Ptolemaic armies of Egypt, among the Clericoi of the Diadochoi power. We have seen the Oscans of Pyrrhus influencing the development of the Tureos in Greece, just as the Celtic invasion, more or less of the same years. So even as Rome dominated Italy, defeating the Italics on land, aligning with their elites and prohibiting them from serving under foreign flags, the factions and units of Italic legions, resolute in their opposition to Rome and unwilling to negotiate, always had the option, perhaps the necessity, of emigrating and serving as mercenary companies through foreign legions overseas. We will see this, right? Because there is an interesting story also before the Roman conquest about this, and it's incredibly nuanced, also in a strict philological and historiographical sense. If this holds, there is no reason to rule out the possibility, of course, that these armed and trained groups from Italian soil traveled abroad on national ships for a very long time. Indeed, it is probable, as Rome likely banned their embarkation, necessitating escape by sea as well. So this may be an extra reason why Roman historiography is relatively silent about Italic activities at sea. That surely, after the decline of the Etruscans, that did go in parallel with Rome, but say would have, in fact, allowed for the rise also of other Italic rulers on the rich coastlands of the peninsula, would have in fact been probably more developed than we think. Consider the aforementioned Mamertines of Messina. After seizing the city and forming their own state, they must have had access to ships and maritime expertise for both profit and warfare. It is also inconceivable that Rhegium, an Italic-founded city strategically positioned on the strait, lacked, for example, established maritime activities for trade and conflict, before it also became sort of the more Hellenic Rhegium, right? This is really obvious. Think about the Etruscans. It's mostly those that we have to look at, because at some point those guys had controlled the entire Tyrrhenian coastline, right? So the Latin one, the Campanian one, that were also the most, the richest and the most advanced. So you know that in Latium, yes, there were some coastal centers also occupied by peoples like the Volsci that, as we will see, were not just raiding with boats. They had fully fledged fleets of conventional warships of the era. Think about Capua, that is also not on the sea, but again, there was some kind of control of the sea. Like, we're looking at fairly advanced polities. We're not of proper Italic stock, so not really, again, anything Etruscan or Hellenic. These had all been under that influence, and so it's impossible to presume that the same rise of Rome and her striking success at sea during the Punic Wars was just a matter of, the Romans invented in the etymological sense. They found out that there were ships and they could build them, right? There is also a fairly less known, but generally speaking, this is notorious, Roman disastrous attempt to colonize Sardinia pretty early on in history on her own. This we were talking before the Punic Wars, by the way, so there is evidently naval projectional capacity in the Italian peninsula in ways that probably we are underestimating. Again, were the Samnites sea wolves? No, right. But lots of other Oscan peoples along the coast would have actually been, right? If anything, they were more pressured, in fact, by these same kins of the hinterland, so they didn't need really to maintain large fleets to fight Rome, actually, at the end of the day. Right. Also, Rome was basically allied with Carthage for a very long time, so that there was, in a way, also we should talk more about naval warfare, not just single battles, but properly the strategic and cost benefits ratio implications of maintaining a fleet in ancient history. But think how profitable this had been, for example, for the Etruscans, that were also not technically a maritime people per se. I mean, they had mostly an interland force with the Decapolis. They were largely terrestrial power, right? But they also excelled at sea. So those would be the proof that whichever sort of Villanovian Italic blend the peninsula would have differently enjoyed. Like the technical capacities, the affluence of they were fairly similar. And so that there is probably more about some peoples rather than others. Again, Tuscany is not, Calabria or Apulia. It's a different context, right? So again, it's not like the Oscans, or even less the Umbrians that didn't even have the sea, or the Sabellians would have had any dramatic naval record in their, especially by the time of the Roman conquest, enacted within their tribal identity. But it's likely that even just by small groups, they traveled by sea much more often than we think, especially as mercenaries, and that there had been a past of greater movement that had partly settled, by the way, the same affirmation of the Italics, basically the relative limits of the same Hellenic colonization, because the Greeks do not go very far colonizing, for example, central northern Italian coastline, right? This is true for the Etruscans that, as we've seen, participated as sea peoples to those trans-Mediterranean military expeditions. Think how coordinated these peoples were, by the way, right? We're talking, again, Lycians, Achaeans, Sardinians, Sicilians. This shows that even, of course, Bronze Age naval warfare that we never actually addressed, if not talking a bit about the Pentaconter, would have been reconfirming the fact that regardless of the primitive times, of course, massive strategic forces could have been put together at sea with a very high degree of operational level and even military success. So when clues and deductions align consistently, they constitute proof by itself. It is therefore certain that the reality along the coasts occupied by the Italic peoples differed greatly from the myths and fragments that have reached us. Even more certain is that, given the near total absence of historical data on the Italic peoples, silence proves nothing, as always, while the clues are meaningful and justify logical inferences, at very least calling for further exploration, which is likely not going to yield overwhelming results. But archaeologically speaking, especially for the ancient world, yes, for that era, there is probably still a lot to picture again. And if you really scratch beneath the surface of conventional, at the end of the day, school history, because this is how we come to eventually just conventionally picture on average, you realize that there is a submerged world that we completely give for granted, right? At least there is, in the last decades, a bit of resurgence of things like, Graham, Hancock, all that stuff. That is sort of only relatively interesting. I especially detest Hancock as this complete charlatan. And it's not like, however, these things may not exist. We just need more proof, and everybody would be happy to see that. But to say, archaeology is very complicated. It's a very complicated story. It's very ideological in many ways, exactly because it lacks tags and it's a bit of a mess. So it's also easier to make districts. But history is way more comforting and securing as far as these relations are concerned. And I would argue that it's probably the key to much easier and sort of straightforward interpretations of history than some even paradoxically more uselessly fragmentary and complicated ones that we create just because we say, but we don't have the full explicit source written somewhere telling us. It doesn't matter. That's not how you make history. Otherwise you truly would just stick to documentary sources. It's not like that. How many times I say that archaeology is overrated. Well, in this case, I'm saying the opposite. It's obvious, right? In this specific context in particular. Now, with this foundation, we can tackle the central question: did these island or coastal Italic peoples only attack navigators upon their landing or shipwreck, as Helleno-mytho-historical accounts would apparently suggest, or did they also venture to sea for fishing, trade, or piracy? Obviously the latter. And again, this is not to say that we're nearly politically organized as the Tyrrhenians, the Hellenes, or the Phoenicians. But obviously they were a presence around. They may have simply been, again, co-opted by those, because after all, what kind of grip did the Etruscans or the Greeks or the Carthaginians really have on, as I said before, also overwhelmingly populated areas like the ones of central, southern Italy or Sicily, etc.? Yeah, they had, but let's say they were sort of forced to at least fight with these people, which means obviously some kind of hybrid through mercenaries, through just auxiliaries of some sort. So they were there, right? They definitely host their presence. So admittedly lesser, but neither trivial nor insignificant, which includes also ships crewed by Italic fishermen, merchants, and pirates, were not proper warriors as warbanders. That would have been actually one of the most typical, the only actual identity that the Italics had at that point, quite concretely. I mean, just these people, the Etruscans, the Greeks, the Venetians, were sufficiently developed and civilized compared to, especially the Italics of the Apennine hinterland, to be other than, again, war bands, right, of freemen in arms devoted to raiding and throat cutting, etc. So remember that thing that we said about the Romans calling the Italics Montani et Agrestes? Well, largely they were right, but in part they were excluding, in fact, what was notorious, that some of these Italics were also Marines, right? It is worth noting that archaeology and myths confirm that since ancient times, precious minerals, Mycenaean ceramics, later orientalizing vases, and wine amphora across the waves. This is most obvious for Italy, right? Migrations are also documented. The Ausonians fled to the Aeolian Islands. These are all lost in myth, in legend, but still, right, we're explicitly told, even by these. Homeric heroes like Ulysses and Diomedes sailed the Mediterranean, followed by Magno-Grecian colonists later. Thus, through coastal, and not even later, right, there was a continuous stream, and again, other peoples were also moving. Because again, the Trojans were not Greeks, right? That is, it's important to stress. And remember what we said before about at least a part of these other populations that we know as Italics may have actually come from a broader east, right, through essentially the Indo-European migrations of groups that were not properly the corded ware culture, etc., the Baltic, Northern European ones, but in fact essentially the Pontic ones, the ones that penetrated to the Danubian Valley and spread throughout the Balkans, Asia Minor, and crossing the Adriatic, in fact entering Italy as well. This is fascinating because this would paradoxically even put the Oscans as initially more seafaring peoples than, for example, the Latins, if we assume that those came instead mostly through, like, across the Alps. They would have been quite mixed. Again, all the peoples who invaded Italy came always from the same place. It's basically roughly Pannonia, right? The Indo-Europeans did that. Later, like the Ostrogoths, the Longobards, they all came from there, right? So even think this in a interestingly separated because especially here, I myself use, for example, maps illustrating the Indo-European spread. Mostly, this depends largely on those who made the maps, right? With this arrows showing you how they spread mostly throughout land, right? But many of them moved by sea, and let's remember that moving by sea at the time was sort of much easier, especially as far as conquest was concerned, than moving through land, right? So it is true that this would have mostly included clans with the retinues as opposed to actual peoples that, I don't know, came at different waves from, I don't know, more mountainous areas in Central Europe or whatever. Think about Alstadt, Latane, etc. For the Celts that were also basically almost the same people that were cousins to the Italics themselves. They spoke basically the same language. So you understand how much we're given for granted. And it's obvious that through coastal voyages and crossings, amid shipwrecks and successful endeavors, Mycenaeans, Greeks, as we later become, especially after the Dorian invasion, the Tyrrhenians, the Sicani, the Sardinians, the Egyptians and Phoenicians navigated all these coasts. Because that's also the other point. Like, it would have surely and obviously been Egyptians and Phoenicians reaching, I don't know, as merchants, especially, the coasts of Italy. Think about the rise of Rome. After all, Rome is not on the sea, but almost, right? The suburban chunk, like, is almost like it does actually arrive to the sea today, but in fact, if you look at the space, at the distance, Rome is fairly close to the sea. The Tiber does connect her so closely to that. It's the last major. In fact, it's becoming the biggest center in Latium at the end of the river valley. That is of the Tiber Valley. That is enormous, right? The Tiber is born in northern Italy. So this is really a powerful highway of projection towards the sea. It's very interesting how the Romans, in this sense, didn't try that much. Probably was, in fact, much more fruitful to take over the hinterland to control the same coasts, given the enormous Italic manpower and demographics that the Romans were able to harness, to brutally harness, and eventually civilize and Romanize, probably hiding the fact, however, that there was some challenge that at sea could have simply not been settled, right? Not because Rome was less powerful than the Italics, but because these would have engaged into naval activities, but they needed to be extirpated at the root in order to be reasonably taken over. Like, this is very, very important. It's not like the Italics turned, in spite of having Italy, it's herself, like with 3,000 kilometers of coastline in the middle of the sea, into any kind of maritime city-states. They didn't, right? Not even the Etruscans technically were properly that. Like the Phoenicians were that. The Greeks to an extent, right? But also the notion of just being at sea, like the Carthaginians, is because you don't have much of an internal navigation. In fact, this is also the major difference between the Phoenicians and the Greeks. That the Phoenicians mostly built markets, right? They didn't expand demographically. The Greeks were more Indo-European, and in that sense, in the patterns of settlement, they preferred probably demographic. They literally at some point took a big chunk of the Polish population and they sent it somewhere else to found a new city. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, other very important antiquarian source, confirms the Tyrrhenians' centuries-long naval dominance with their migration likely by sea from Lydia. Again, the origin of the Etruscans is very hotly debated. I'm not going to address this topic. Again, what matters here is likely that they were part of those sea peoples, military clans that at some point decided, okay, where's a good place where we can install themselves? They knew about Tuscany and they chose that, right? Because it was easier. Like, for example, that would explain so much how the Etruscans are apparently apparently different in a cultural sense from the rest of the Italians. Because the Italics would have been kind of Indo-Europeans moving mostly from, and we know that from the continent, so by land, right? Whereas Lydia, the Levant, was sort of more civilized, and it's possible that some clans installed themselves from there, right? We're talking largely Indo-Europeans that, as we will see also better in other videos, had largely taken over, at least as in turn, lords, leaders, some more civilized, Anatolian community, and then eventually settled from there with their naval power that, for example, the Italics in that distinction did not have because we were more primitive terrestrial Indo-Europeans into Tuscany, all right? And this obviously, because we're literally told by Dionysius that the Tyrrhenians came from Lydia, right? It remains one of, in fact, of the most, let's say, of the hottest takes, at least one of actually the most reliable, rather, but still, in fact, clamorous in this sense, showing that the Tyrrhenians were conceived properly to move from the eastern to the western Mediterraneans, daring, powerful, and commanding a navy that, in this sense, would take over basically Italy, the Italian coastlines. As you know, that's basically what happened, spanning both the Tyrrhenian and Adriatic seas, by the way, because the Etruscans weren't just controlling the Tyrrhenian, and this confers to, in fact, to the picture a much more neatly outlined Italian character, which obviously encompasses the Italics in the process. They were already there themselves, they were coming in the same exact time. So this is very, very powerful. As we've seen, the Lydians were themselves in the list of the sea peoples together with what would have been the Etruscans, basically. So there would have been also important differences. And again, in fact, the Etruscans are largely like, if we see the average person that we think was an Etruscan, they were native Italians. Not much people come from the east. So what was characteristic of the Etruscans and their thalassocracy in this space was, in fact, needing the ports along Italy's extensive coastline, sheltered anchorages, harbors, fresh water sources, timber for repairing hulls and masts, and supplies to restock provisions, because ships cost a freaking lot. Obviously enough, without Italian resources, the Etruscans could have not done that. And of course, it's simple if you are already a tendentially hegemonic naval force in the region to control the river mouths. Remember, the ones along which the same Italics of the continent, so to say, were communicating with the outer world. And essentially, by controlling those, to control the entire market inland. This is what many other peoples were doing, would keep doing. Thus, even the formidable Tyrrhenians required colonies or at least naval bases were feasible. Otherwise, to access support points, they had to negotiate with the Italics who held the coast, or at least to clash with them. These peoples, they surely exchanged goods through trade or plunder, but likely also recruited allied crews and ships. Other big elephant in the room. Obviously, the Etruscan system, as you know, goes under a deep crisis, and this is especially also fought on land. The Romans are basically subjecting the Etruscans as well, and this does bring, of course, also the Romans in the same time in the direction of the Italics herself. So this is very interesting from a Roman perspective that we all often tend to sense in describing that continental fashion, but that was likely incredibly aware also due to, as we've seen, that Latin river highway of the implications of living the Italics without master, let's say, and especially knowing that Rome herself was not capable of investing simply on a naval strategy, and for doing what? Just to perpetuate what the Etruscans had done. They had enough manpower to do something way more consistent. Again, explaining what Rome did, especially in that fateful 5th, 4th century BC, is something incredible. It's metaphysical, it's religious, it's spiritual. It can't be reduced to this kind of calculations. But obviously enough, like it belonged to that sort of Latin DNA to simply take on their enemies by physical storm, right? And subjecting them and, offering them this redemptionally transfiguring deal, right, of manumitting them after having subjugated them and given them permission to fight for Rome. It's something extremely, extremely deep, and could have not been part probably of a naval design that seemed more, not parasitary, but surely more based on enrichment. It's a bit the same reason why, I don't know, the Romans took over Carthage at some point, right? And there wasn't much, again, behind this this naval choice that, especially in the ancient world, could simply hold the major fundamentals of a regional power, right? It was too much of a static system. Again, the Carthaginians, the Phoenicians were the primary example of that. They didn't really have even interest to expand through colonies to manpower. It's always the same thing. There's an oligarchy that does not want the richest elements, the people, to basically rise to that kind of power itself. And this is really different and anthropologically wise in the vision that Rome had regarding to this. This is, again, incredibly important and worth of a particular consideration in cultural comparison. Egyptian records of the Sea Peoples attacks in the last quarter of the second millennium BC do not mention, as you understand here properly, Italic peoples, right? We hear, of course, from the peninsula, the Etruscans. The Sicilians, as we've seen, may have been very closely related in that sense, because, again, it's not like we can simply identify. Yes, there are, again, the Sicilian peoples of probably also that Italic or gradually becoming Italic stock, but we don't have like a notion of a major Sicilian civilization like the one of Sardinia, for example. That is also something different. But this Egyptian silence regarding the Italics permits the hypothesis that under the dominant Etruscans, whose name was significant enough to name the sea, right, of Italy de facto, a more diverse reality existed, namely that their fleets included Italic, just to say what the Romans would have called them later, Sulci navales, so properly naval allies. This is fascinating because the Romans, again, used the term themselves, and they had such naval auxiliaries themselves, showing that it wasn't just a novelty. By the way, the Roman expansion across Italy is paralleled. We will make a video about this by an incredibly clever and relentless effort of Rome to have herself being monetarily recognized on the major markets at that point, mostly of southern of Magna Graecia. And so giving, like, again, Rome this attributing to the same Rome the gold standard would have protected those traffics, right, if things had simply gone smoothly. And as you know, this was also what triggered, for example, again, the clash with Pyrrhus regarding the struggle over Taurus, etc. So Rome was especially and incredibly inflexible, was a veritable steamroller that the Romans couldn't properly even get the meaning of defeat. Even the Caudinian forks didn't really affect them in their stone-like granitic resolve of complete conquest, right? By the way, it's important to observe regarding the sea peoples list that the same Sardinians were quite advanced at the time, but the same Sicels had fleets, right? So this doesn't really add up, right? It is true that, of course, Sardinia and Sicily are two islands, but why wouldn't mainland Italy would have joined this raid? It doesn't really make much sense. It's really not credible. You can imagine literally early, because Rome was actually inhabited, as you know, in those times. It didn't exist conceptually as a city, but it was already something in that direction as a conglomeration of different communities. There are surely early Romans that participated. So Romans, so to say, of course, just in a geographical sense, that participated to the raids on Egypt together with the Etruscans, right? These early Etruscans, by the way, because it's not like those were necessarily even fully fledged as we understand the Etruscans that we know mostly from later. By the way, we know of specific trade hubs that the Etruscans somehow controlled. The same mouth of the Tiber and Volturno rivers, or other waterways near Ponte Cagnano, a very important archaeological site we'll talk about at some point. So the Etruscans weren't just there every once in a while, right? They really were there often, and whoever sort of founded their civilization in Italy was already well tied to these. Those were the gates for the Italic hinterland during, again, surely a moment in which these peoples were flowing into the peninsula itself, but that, especially in that case, would make it even more likely that they were probably not even, I mean, think about it at the time, not even understanding the concept of Italy like as a simple geographical boundary. We know it even from the migration era when the Longobards entered Italy. It's not like the various groups without a common monarch like understood the concept of Italy. They even crossed the Alps. They went over into Burgundy to be crushed, by the way. So imagine in the age of heroes during the Bronze Age, how an Indo-European warrior would have considered just dirt, earth, and just pursuing instead the heavenly glory. So actually, like the later Italics, in all their courageous warlikeness, would actually be just a bit like gentrified individuals compared to these early ones. So this is a very important point we can make in favor of that explanation, that reconstruction. And we will, in another video, talk mostly about the later Italic, later evidence for Italic naval warfare. Right, so we're talking mostly the time of the Roman conquest of Italy, but also and especially, in fact, a moment of greater historical clarity, but not necessarily, again, it requires some refined allusion to the possibility of this Italic power on its own. This is, again, incredibly important. I was very glad to talk about this. Right. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.